Hey everyone, I'm going to make a value scale and then do a couple test paintings. I'm going to start with some black acrylic paint at one end of the palette, and I'm going to squirt about the size of a Hershey Kiss of the black, and then the same with the white. And I'm going to call this 100, this 0, and I'm going to try to mix a 50. I'm using permanent black and titanium white, which is opaque. We'll talk about transparent colors later. And I'm going to mix with a plastic palette knife. And you always want to try and start with using your light color first. So I'm going to cut off a little chunk of white, stick it in the middle. And before I try to mix the 50, I'm going to show you why you want to typically start with the lights first. I'm going to grab a little less black, and the reason that you want to mix dark into light is that you don't end up with as much paint. You can kind of control it. It takes less of the dark to tint or shift the color. So I used a little small amount to see where it went, and it looks more like a 30 or a 40. I'm going to try and also get in the habit of, before dipping into my other color, to wipe my brush off so that, or my palette knife off, so that I don't contaminate that. I'm going to just wipe that off. I'm going to grab a little more. You can see also that I'm trying to pull from the side of the paint so that I'm not disrupting all of it. And when I mix, I kind of want to scoop it in a pile back and forth. Like that. And I mix it a lot so that I know I've got it all blended together. I'm going to wipe off my palette knife again. Now I'm going to try to mix a 30. And then I'll try to do a 70. And that's enough for the palette, because then we can mix the 80s, 90s, the 60s, the 40s, the 20s, and so forth, the 10s in between. So I'm going to grab again a little light, and I'm going to grab some of this. You can see as I mix, it really starts to blend together, but it takes a little pushing it around. One of the things I see people do wrong with a palette knife sometimes is I see them try to stir it, and that it doesn't blend the pigments together. So it's more that you're like kind of squishing it into a little pile and pushing it together. So it looks pretty good. I'm going to wipe my knife off again. And I'm going to grab a little of my 50. And I'm going to grab a little of the black. And then I've got my scale, 170, 50, 30, 0. Wipe that off. You can clean your palette knife also by swirling it in your water to help get some of the extra off. If your plastic palette knife dries with paint on it, it can get a little chunky, so you want to try and keep it fairly clean. If you had an expensive metal palette knife, you can scrape it off with a razor knife, but we'll just use our plastics for now. Okay. So now that I have my palette mixed up, I'm going to try and do a couple different attempts at using the paint in different ways. So this one here says, let's build 3 shapes with thick paint. And because these are little tests, I'm just going to use a large flat brush. Right, switch. Use this one. It's synthetic and has a good snap to it. And I'm just going to grab maybe my 70. Sometimes it's helpful when your brush is new or dry to charge it with a little water first and then load your brush with the paint. And just see when you're playing with the materials how the brushes function. What happens when the brush starts to dry out, and if you wanted to charge it with a little more water so that you can get an edge that is crisp. So before I wash my brush out and to switch colors, I'm going to take my palette knife, and in the value I'm using, I'm going to try and scrape a lot of that paint back out onto the palette so that I'm not contaminating and putting a ton of it into my water. So I'm trying to get that off the brush and use it later. And I'll scrub the brush on the bottom of my water cup, dry it out a little, and then clean it off on a towel. I'm going to switch to my 30, and it feels a little thick, or a little viscous would be the word. So I'm going to add a little water. And the more paint that you use, the easier it is to get harsher lines and cleaner edges. You can see how opaque this white paint is because I have just completely painted out the text. You can see where some of that other black paint is lifting up from where it was wet. I'm going to switch to a new value, scrape the paint out, rinse my brush, dry it on a towel a little bit. And I think I'm going to actually just use white. It's also good to turn your surfaces so that your arm and your shoulder work in a direction that help make the paint move. My paper is rolling up a little, so I'm going to hold it down. You can see here it's a little rough on the edge, so I'm going to add a little more paint. And then while it's wet, I just see maybe what happens if I were to mix into some of the other areas. So these are just tests to kind of see what will happen as you layer paint and work them in different ways. Again, you can see that that white is really opaque and covering that gray underneath. I might leave that one for now. This one, it says, let's try and tape a straight edge. So I'll show you how I mean that. And clean off my brush and save a little of my white. You can leave your brushes in the water while you're working, but if you had really nice expensive brushes, you don't want to leave them in there very long, or it'll start to deteriorate the ferrule, the wood, the glue inside, and the bristles. I do not take very good care of my inexpensive brushes. As you can see, the paint is all chipping off. Okay, so to tape a straight edge, you can do this with Scotch tape or painter's tape. Might do a shape. And sometimes it's good to take a little bit of the sticky off, but not too much. It also is helpful to make a little handle, so I folded back two of the edges so I can pick them up successfully later. And you can see how hard edge we can make this shape. Do another one. I'm going to seal just the edge that I'm going to be painting into in the corners and push down. I'm going to be careful not to push on the outside because I really don't want it to stick to the paper. It does have a tendency to tear. So I'm just doing the close edge. And when I do start painting, I want to paint away from the seam. I'm just going to use the same brush. And I'll use a little 50. So I have to negotiate that edge. I get the paint to go up to it, but I also don't want to push the paint up under the tape. This works really well if you paint out one value and then let it dry and then you can tape on top of it. I can show you that when I have one that's dry in a minute. Pull over. You always want to peel at an angle so that you can course correct if the tape starts to tear the paper. See how these handles are helpful. And you can see how I've created a pretty clean, sharp shape. I'm going to do another one next to it to show you how it can be really fun if you do something really messy inside of it. You can create a nice visual tension between the straight edge of the tape and a really painterly kind of mark. So again, I'm going to seal just the edges that I'm working on. And I'm going to do something where I'm going to load the brush with a little bit of 30 on one side and maybe a little bit of 70 on the other. And we'll see how it goes. I'm going to try to cut a straight edge down that line. I'm going to be careful when I get to the edge with the tape and go the other direction. And this I'm going to make kind of swirly. And we'll see how it did. Again, peel the tape at an angle. You'll notice that I didn't let the paint dry. You can let it dry for a little while, but you just have to be careful not to get the messy tape rolling up in other places. So it has a cool effect when you've got something really painterly inside of it. I got a little hiccup right there. You can see where the tape didn't quite take. In the background, I might let this dry and then I could do a quick wash. So I'm going to show you a wash on another one. I'm going to take whatever is on my brush. It's pretty wet. So it's more like watercolor. And I've kind of flooded the surface. I'm going to take my 100 and see how the ink reacts in a kind of fluid way. I might add a little more water here. And we don't exactly know what this is going to look like until it dries. I think this is a little too shapy here. I'm going to add a little water. And then I might go in with some white in the middle because we know that our white is pretty opaque. And I'm going to try and hide the words that say create a wash of paint. I'm using quite a bit. This paint is so inexpensive. So my vote is to use it. I feel like a lot of times people struggle when they paint because they don't use enough. That one's pretty chunky. You can see that. That water is still doing fun stuff. So we'll come back. We'll see what that one looks like. That could be pretty cool. This one says, let's try using cross-hatching marks. So I've got this white paint on my brush. So just like you would with your pencils or your markers, you can do something kind of painterly and use a kind of choppier mark. It got a little sticky, so I'm going to add a little water. That's a little too washy, so I'm going to add a little more paint. Notice that I'm not overworking any of these. I think I'm going to leave this one kind of pale. I might actually add a little white. If something isn't going the value direction or color direction that you want it to, you can scrape it off and course correct if you want. And then try again. So it has a kind of choppy, cross-hatchy kind of gestural mark. I'm going to try and use the brush in a little bit of a different way. This one says, let's make some swirls by twisting the brush. So I have a little white on here, and I'm going to grab a little of my 50, maybe a little white on the other side. Oops, contaminated that a little bit. I can fix that later. you can make a background pretty quickly to feel pretty textured and has movement and lots of overlapping without a ton of work. I grab a little black. You can just try some different techniques. At some point while you're doing these tests, you should be thinking about what your design is going to look like so that you can decide if any of these techniques are going to work well with your brand. And like we did in project 2, where we talked about how the mark making can influence the way that your viewer understands the mood or the meaning or the temperament of the work, it can be the same with the way that you build marks. But you can really make some pretty cool painting techniques with a really fast background, and then do drawings on top of it or do little tiny work on top later, which I'll show you in one of the ones as it dries. This one says, let's try 3 strong values. So I've got a lot of paint in there that's kind of in the pale range. I'm going to grab that. Kind of squiggle it on in a different way. Maybe I'll use a little bit of that wash again. Rinse my brush because I'm getting muddy. And just try some different stuff. I'm going to add a lot of black. And I might, while I layer, let some of that black sit on the top. So I'm really trying not to disrupt those layers underneath. Again, if I don't like how something is going, I'm just going to take that off. Save that there. Rinse my brush out again. I still don't like how that went. I'm going to take a dry brush and change that mark making. Maybe. I might throw that one away. We'll see. This one says you can try to mix right on the surface. So I'm out of white. I'm going to put some more white on my palette. I'm not using quite as much because I know I'm coming to the end of my painting, so I want to not overdo it. I'm going to grab some white, and I'm going to grab a little 30, and we can see. I'll use my palette knife to move the paint around, leave it a little painterly, a little more white here. Looks good. I like that one. And then this is my last one, and it just says layer, layer, layer. So let's see what we end up with. So I'm almost done painting all my surfaces, so I'm going to really try to use up my paint. And it's going on really thick. Trying to keep my values having some contrast. I'm going to rinse out my brush and put some clean whites in there. Quite a bit of paint. Kind of picked up some of that area. That one's pretty fun. Like that one. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the one I did at the beginning. I had a big blob of paint right there, so it's still going to be wet, but this black is dry, the gray is dry. And now I can go in and try to do some detail if I wanted. So I'll use a littler brush, little black. And you can choose to do this with paint, or you can choose to do this with your felt tip markers, Sharpies, or gel pens, but not your microns. And you can start to add detail just like we did with our other materials. And I'm using quite a lot of paint. And I have to remind myself that a paintbrush mark is different than a marker. And if I want that really mechanical graphic quality, then maybe the right choice would be to use a different kind of material like a marker. But I'm not sure if I can pull this off. I'll see if I can do it. Something you can do is once they're dry, I'm just tearing this because my white's still wet. I'm going to try to make a tiny little line with my tape over my black. Clean out my small brush. And I'm going to take white. Run it down the seam. And then remove the tapes. And you can make little details happen that way. So you can see how like something really basic can become layered and more complicated as you continue to let it dry and do some building. This one's pretty dry, so what I might try here is with some really thin down water. See the value, I want it lighter. I can fill in the spaces around it. Wipe it off. And because this is more of a watercolory feel, I'm just kind of doing something fun. I just picked up some black from my painting surface, but okay with that. So there you go. Hopefully that's helpful. Just seeing a couple different ways that you can use the paint. I'll hold up some of the ones that were really wet and goopy earlier. This one's still super wet, but because I have this black paint, let's see. If I can add maybe another layer, like a frame. So you can do some real tiny little marks even when it's wet, but I'm trying to be careful to keep my value shifts from getting too mushy. Look at this water is kind of making it bleed down. That's going to be pretty when it dries. And that's pretty how that dried. Let me get one of the, this was one of the cross-hatching ones. Okay, so hopefully you have fun making some of your own painting tests. When you're done, if you have a bunch of paint left over, you can scoop it up. I don't have much. That's always the trick, is to try to use just enough. So this, it's not that much. I might actually just make another little test with it. But if you have enough of it, you can scoop it up and put it in a little jar with a lid. And here on home lockdown, I don't really have any of those small jars with me, unfortunately. They were in your kit, so maybe you have one. But you put them in those little bead jars, scrape them in, and then it should stay wet for like a week or two. Okay, so I'm excited to see your paintings, and we'll touch base soon via Zoom. Okay, bye.